Hey everyone, welcome to the 76 Research Platform. I am Trish Regan. I am joined by the co-founder at 76 Research, my good friend Rob Hordon. Rob, always good to see you.
Great to see you, Trish.
So we got a lot to cover today. There's a lot going on in the economy right now. How would you characterize it?
Well, I think, as we've been talking about, the big theme and problem in the economy is inflation. That's been driving markets. It's been driving the political situation. And really what we're seeing now is a growing tension between asset owners and people who don't own assets and people who are, borrowers, right? So I think that's a very big theme now. And, we saw that recently with the RFK comments where, he kind of really went after the Fed and located blame on the economy to with the actions of the Fed, which there's a lot of merit to that point of view, I think, given the way asset prices have exploded over the last 4 years, both the stock market, real estate, that's all, directly related to, both the actions of the federal government on the fiscal side, overstimulating the economy, but also the Federal Reserve keeping monetary policy extremely easy, even in the face of very clear signals of impending inflation.
We have heard some commentary as of late. You mentioned RFK, and he made some pretty big accusations. His frustration with the Fed was quite palpable. Let me play that for everybody. If you haven't heard this, it's definitely worth hearing because it's pretty significant. Here he is sitting down with Ben Shapiro, talking about how the Fed is just, frankly, stealing your money. Watch.
Middle class after World War II became the greatest economic engine in the history of mankind. And a large part of that, of course, we destroyed the industrial base of Europe and we owned everything. But also, we spent that money wisely in making sure every veteran got into a house. Every member of that generation basically was able to own a home. And you had this ferment of entrepreneurial energy, what Franklin Roosevelt called America's industrial genius, that was released. And, when I was in 1960, when I was a kid, we owned half the wealth on the face of the earth. And it wasn't owned by an oligarchy. It was owned by the American middle class. And, we've adopted a lot of policies, and particularly the way the Fed is operated, which is a criminal agency, right? It's just a vacuum cleaner for Wall Street to shift wealth upward to this, to this kleptocracy, and it's a captured agency. They're all captured.
I found it interesting that he said that. So I agree with some aspects of it, some aspects not so much. I mean, I do think that there are times when having a central bank and a centralized effort to kind of plan what's going on can actually be pretty helpful. I mean, I think back to the dark days of 2008, et cetera. Granted, I mean, you could also blame the Fed for getting us in that mess to begin with, right? I mean, the reality is, had it not been for all that free, cheap, easy money for far too long, you wouldn't have had some of the crazy CDS products that wound up digging us down into that hole and creating that mess. A lot of blame perhaps to go around as we look back to '08, and the Fed is part of it. That said, you kind of needed them there in the darkest hour. When I think back to March 2020, one of my big points at the time was like, everybody's freaking out, everybody's going hysterical, and I'm like, hello, you got the Federal Reserve. Like you really don't need to go totally crazy because you know what they're going to do. Unfortunately, they did a little too much of it, shall we say, Rob? And they just kept printing and printing and printing like it was never going to. I mean, it didn't end. Even in February of 2022? Or it go all the way to 23. I was looking at these numbers.
We didn't start hiking until early 22. Yeah.
I mean, it's crazy, right? Like they were just the spigot was open and it was game on. I mean, what do you think's going to happen?
Right. No, and I think RFK's critique is interesting because what he's saying is the reason they were so erring on the side of overstimulating is that they're aligned with the asset owners. And if you look at what's happened over the last 4 years, the stock market is over this 4 year period is up nearly something like 90%. The home price index is up 50%. So the people making the decisions are the people who are themselves asset owners, or kind of the politicians, right? Like the people who raise money from asset owners, and they erred on the side of overstimulating, and they enacted policies that were very favorable to asset owners. And the result is over 20% inflation since then, but much greater growth in nominal asset values. So if you look at the top 1% or top 5%, they've actually done well.
Great. I mean, that's what really stinks though for your average American, right? I mean,
Yeah.
because you've helped those with assets, the value of their property, because they're homeowners, that's gone up. The value of their stock portfolio has gone up. But it really hurts. It's like a bad tax on those everyday folks who are like, wait a second, like I'm paying 50% more for eggs and 40% more to fill up my gas tank. And by the way, wages haven't kept in line with that at all. Wages are barely growing in comparison to the massive inflation that we've seen. So they all start out with the right intention, right? The Federal Reserve is like trying to help everyone theoretically, but instead they help that uber top 1%.
You know what's fascinating, Trish? I was actually looking into William Jennings Bryan's 1896 Cross of Gold speech, and it was like very similar circumstances, except the exact opposite. You had the populist complaining about the gold standard and an overly restrictive central bank, and then you had the moneyed interests on the East Coast who were bondholders who were kind of advocates of deflation and wanted to stick to the gold standard. And so it's a very similar dynamic, except completely opposite, where you had the farmers who were worried about deflation and wheat prices, advocating for a bimetallic monetary system, to have silver introduced. And it's interesting because RFK himself, just moving in the opposite direction, is talking about Bitcoin being, introduced as an element of our, as part of like kind of introducing a new form of the gold standard. So it's moving in the exact opposite direction.
I mean, you think about, I've joked about sort of Bretton Woods 2.0. Could we ever go back to the gold standard? And I think, we all know the answer is no, because there's not enough gold at this point to deal with how much money we've printed. But even with that said, like it's fascinating to think about like these different paths that we could take in the future. And I'm not saying it's going to happen now. I'm not saying it's going to happen 5 years from now or even 10 years from now. But I mean, clearly there is a desire on behalf of so many countries around the world to be in some kind of currency other than the US dollar, right? Like, because the US dollar in their eyes, while granted it's holding up. I was just over in Ireland,
Yep.
and I was like, whoa, finally, my dollar is actually doing something. And it's been getting better. And that's because the ECB is cutting while we seem like we're hanging on for dear life. I know the Fed would love to cut, and it's probably not going to happen. They may do it before the election because they just want to. But if they do, I think it's really for political reasons. But if the dollar holds up relative to everything else, et cetera, still, I think that you have a lot of countries around the world that are like, wait a second, I don't love this, but yet they're not looking to go into the renminbi anytime soon. Like there's no other, they're not going to go to euros. They don't really have another place to go. So when does like the electronic option really become a viable one? I wonder.
Yeah, and we see
years?
we've talked about
years?
this with gold. That central banks are buying gold, and we see commodity prices going up generally. So, the reason you have a gold standard in the first place, or you want to have something like that, is just to have monetary stability. The supply of gold is limited, and that's sort of the point of gold, or the value of gold. But we're in this era now where you don't have monetary stability, and all of the countries, the major economies around the world are printing, and all of them will continue to print because they're managing through very significant debt loads.